This holiday season, give the gift that stands for something greater with Milwaukee's own Chase My Creations. At Chase My Creations, the vision is to lead the way in spreading the message of justice, love, and compassion as we journey towards a more equitable future. This year, make your gifts count. Choose from our unique collection of socially conscious clothing that speaks to the heart of justice and compassion. Visit ChaseMyCreations.com and find the perfect gift that not only looks good, but also does good. Chase My Creations, fashion for a just future. Happy holidays from our family to yours. Welcome to Pulse Check, Wisconsin. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. This is Dr. Ford from Pulse Check, Wisconsin, and I wanted to wish you all a very happy New Year. We are wrapping up the holiday season, and New Year, new Pulse Check, Wisconsin episode for everyone out there. This episode, I wanted to cover the topic of wellness, specifically wellness for all of our healthcare professionals, but for everyone out there in the Pulse Check audience. This episode, we were very fortunate to have with us Dr. Cassie Ferguson, who is a pediatric ER doctor, and she specializes in wellness for not only healthcare professionals, but also for our medical school trainees. Now, with that being said, although this is a new year, and looking back at the previous year, we unfortunately saw a tragedy that happened in Madison, Wisconsin. My home institution of University of Wisconsin was affected, and University of Wisconsin hospital staff and faculty participated in the care of those victims. If you guys want to go back on the YouTube channel, and I'll post it here as well, just a little excerpt. We did a video, myself and some of the alumni throughout the country, as well as some state officials, including the governor and lieutenant governor, Representative Francesca Hong, who represents the Madison area at the state assembly level, came out and gave some words of encouragement to the healthcare providers that took care of the victims of this mass shooting. During our Politics of Public Health episode with Dr. Megan Schultz, as well as Representative Deb Andraka, we talked about the groups that are most vulnerable, and that is our pediatric demographic. And so, I won't go in and rehash a lot of the things that we discussed in that episode, but feel free to go back. And unfortunately, we got to keep working towards our goal of reducing the amount of school shootings that we see, of reducing the amount of mass shootings that we see in this country. But I wanted to extend my sentiments still to University of Wisconsin Hospital, to the entire Madison community, as well as to all those affected by that shooting. So again, to introduce Dr. Cassie Ferguson, she is a professor of pediatrics. She's previously served in the roles of quality improvement and patient safety. As a lot of you remember from our first season, she was paramount in putting together our Health Scholars Pathway. And that program, again, is to encourage and to get more matriculants from the community into medicine in hopes of giving back to the community. And so I wanted to bring her on to talk about some of her experiences, as well as talk about some of the next steps now in order to help push the envelope and to help create open dialogues, dealing with community issues, dealing with community building, mental health treatment for healthcare professionals, as well as how we reduce stigmatization about mental health treatment. So with that being said, it is my distinguished pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Cassie Ferguson. Okay. Well, again, thanks for being with us here today. I gave an intro at the very beginning talking about all the amazing things that you're doing, both in the city of Milwaukee and at Children's and just for the state of Wisconsin. But if you could you give us a little bit of your background and tell us what inspired you to pursue this amazing career in medicine?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm actually a Milwaukee transplant. I grew up in Oakland, California, which there's certainly some similarities between Oakland and Milwaukee in really strong positive ways and some ways that aren't as positive. But I loved growing up in the Bay Area. I think it had a lot to do with how I approach both my career and my personal life. But my dad was an architect. My mom, I think you could best describe her as a social justice advocate. She's done a lot of work in many different areas, but I think that sort of best captures what it is she did. So there was really no one in my family, whether it was my immediate family or extended family, who was in medicine or in healthcare at all. I think growing up, I at one point wanted to be a chef, designer, an elementary school teacher, all over the map. I think what was important is that my parents, no matter what I had decided that I was going to do that week or that month or that year, were always very supportive of what I wanted to do. My mom's main rule was that whatever I chose, I had to be the best at that thing, or at
There you go.
least, attempt to be the best at that thing. So I certainly still hold that maxim really, really close to my heart. And I also saw how my parents lived their lives, and I realized that to live in or to work and live in service of other people was probably the most satisfying way to live. So then I went off to UCLA, and in my third year, I went to do an externship at the Health Policy Research Center at George Washington University.
Hmm.
At the time, I thought that I wanted to do something along the lines of public health or epidemiology. And I mean, honestly, I really went because my best friend was going. I wanted to spend 3 months in Washington, D.C. And while I was there, I did work on really looking at infant mortality rates between Black mothers, Latino mothers, and white mothers. And specifically, because I was in Washington, D.C., I had a lot of interaction with women who had moved from El Salvador, Central America
Mm.
mostly. And I had the opportunity to really spend time in a lot of clinics talking to people who cared for women who were, having families. And I learned a lot about how we were, as a country, failing mothers,
Hmm.
but it really stood out to me that we were failing Black mothers in particular, and that there was no social support, there was no network of support. And as a result, infants were dying. And I really learned during that time that I didn't want to be studying these women from afar. I wanted to be taking care of them directly. And so
Hmm.
I got home one day when I was still in DC, and I wrote all the classes. I was a psychology major at the time, and I wrote all the classes that I would have to take to go to med school. Realized that that would mean an extra year in college. And so that's what I did. I took an extra year and then another year to apply and work, make some money, and then off I went to Wisconsin, which was the state I had never visited, nor at the time could probably reliably pick out on a map, since Californians are we're very California centric. That's a problem.
That's fair.
Um, yeah. So, and here I am.
Awesome. Well, what an amazing journey and selfless journey too. A lot of folks that we have on have a similar pathway through medicine or pathway through whatever work that they're doing here. We had a couple folks on from VODR that had a similar journey through, started out as a teacher and then went to advocacy and got more information, got more hands-on experience with that population. And so one of the things that I commend you for doing is to take that step back, especially rerouting your career and saying, okay, this is what I want to do and the steps that I need to take in order to not only help the situation, but identify it in that first person stance. And the work that you do now as well, it also is a testimony to it because currently you're in pediatric ER over at Children's, correct?
Yes, I did my residency training in pediatrics and my fellowship training in pediatric emergency medicine in Denver, Colorado, and then came back to Milwaukee in 2010. And I've been at Children's ever since.
Yeah. And a lot of that what you said in the beginning it mirrors to what my mom said as well. The fact that whatever you're gonna do, you got to be good at it, right? And so you hear that over and over again with pediatric emergency providers as well as on the adult side too. We have all these things that we're interested in and kind of focusing it in, but the recurrent theme is to help people, and so that's the good part about it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, I enjoy being that sort of that adage, the, jack of all trades, master of none. I don't mind not knowing, you know, so much about so many things, but I really love the fact that I can walk into almost any room, get a sense for what the family needs, what the patient needs pretty quickly, and then be able to draw on resources, whether they're my own, or my colleagues or a social workers or a nurses, and put together, a plan for the patient. And I think that's what's so incredible about emergency medicine is that we really understand that it takes a whole bunch of people to take care of
Mhm.
other human beings. So that's why I love
Especially,
it.
exactly. And especially another one of the hats that you wear is that you are co-director for the Health Equity Scholars Program that we had on last season as well. So very much commend you for that. But one of the things that is very consistent in programs like that and that program in general is to take into account the entirety of the patient too. I feel like emergency medicine is very unique in that respect, in that we are sort of the gatekeepers of the hospital, right? So it's the only place where you have patients that come off of the street and then they become a patient, right? And all that goes into, that presentation and considering those factors when you're considering next steps to disposition as well as how to treat this patient. And also, what's the safest way for them to go home? What is the most realistic way for them to pursue treatment or even have access to that treatment?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that is, and perhaps this came, I remained a psychology major when I was in college, and always found it really interesting to, to understand, to sort of have the skills or the tools to be able to try and unlock what people need in any
Hmm.
given situation. And I think it's honestly what drove me to be a part of the Health Equity Scholars Program, because this idea that we cannot care for other people without a holistic understanding of what it is they need, which entails, really understanding their strengths and what they're bringing to any situation. And I think we forget that in patients, particularly when we're seeing them at their most vulnerable, is this
Hmm.
idea that, they're whole people outside of our emergency department.
Right.
And, they have whole lives that have nothing to do with us. And we're really just there for a sliver of time. And so how do we take into account everything about them in that very small, period of time that we are there to help. And I see that as a challenge, but the most interesting part of our job.
Yeah. And not only patients, one of the things that you also have specialized in is leading focus on the well-being of physicians and medical students in your career. What led you to focus on that? I know you said you had a background in psychology, but what other things kind of led you to focus in that pathway?
So when I started as an attending physician, I had just left fellowship in Denver and coming back to Milwaukee. And there's that first couple years when you are suddenly, a real live doctor.
Hmm.
um, and I took some time to really understand what it is I wanted to do with the part of my life that wasn't clinical, as an academic physician. And what I was drawn to immediately was really the area of quality improvement and patient safety. I was both like fascinated and completely terrified that, we had all of this knowledge, all of this information about how to best care for patients. And yet, in some cases, less than half of our patients were actually receiving that treatment. And that's, across the board, not just pediatrics, but in adult medicine as well. And that it felt like a waste. It felt like we had this opportunity, we've been spending millions and millions of dollars to try and, and to research into what would best serve our patients. And really through an ignorance of what it meant to get those treatments to the bedside and into patients' homes, we were really wasting all of that money. And so I kind of dove into quality improvement right away, both into doing projects focused on patients with chronic illnesses who were had to come to the emergency department frequently because of their illness. So patients with diabetes, for example, who would present with diabetic ketoacidosis, or patients with sickle cell anemia who are presenting in pain crises, and recognizing that they spent hours in our emergency department, and how could we better care for them, and ensure that they were getting the treatments that they should be getting. So that's how it that's how I started my career. And one of them, I taught this program called the Quality Improvement and Patient Safety Pathway, which was really meant to teach medical students who were interested in quality improvement, sort of help them learn more about it. And I had a group of faculty members advising me. And one of those faculty members, who's a pediatric critical care doctor, handed me this paper. This was back in, I think, 2015 or so. Handed me this paper, and it was called Finding Joy and Meaning in the Workplace. And it was written by this institute called the Lucian Leap Institute, which was a patient safety institute. And it was the first time I had ever read something that sort of took the healthcare workers' perspective into consideration when they were talking about patient safety. And the bottom line was, if we are not safe, if we don't feel safe as providers, as clinicians, we cannot provide safe care to patients. And right. That was sort of just opened my eyes to this whole other aspect of quality improvement that I felt we hadn't really really explored as a profession. And so right then, that year, I started to teach our quality improvement students about burnout specifically. And I had someone, Paula Davis, who was a lawyer and became an expert in burnout and resilience. And she and I started something called the MCW Resilience Project. And we just put together a curriculum for those students. And it was pretty basic at the time, but that was how I got started.
Yeah. And you brought up a couple of good points there, especially the impact of burnout. And I feel like that's not only unique to our specialty, but you see it in healthcare. You see it, kind of throughout, any other professional careers. For physicians specifically, could you talk a little bit about, what burnout is and the consequences for burnout for both, not only physicians, but medical students, both professionally and personally, especially as we're starting to see more and more, mental health crises in healthcare professionals, unfortunately, in recent years?
Oh, absolutely. So I think, before digging into the consequences of burnout, I think it's really important to highlight and to make it very clear that burnout is an occupational phenomenon. This is not, we don't see burnout outside of the workplace. And it's really a group of symptoms that result from chronic workplace stress. It didn't appear for a long time in the medical, like in the list of our diagnoses. It didn't appear. It was really described throughout the decades, really from the 1970s, just in the workplace in general. It wasn't specific to medicine. But we have sort of co-opted the term in medicine. And in some ways, we use it as sort of a catch-all for unwellness in medicine. And I want to make it clear that this is when I think of burnout, really that sort of trifecta of emotional exhaustion and cynicism and sort of a sense of that you've lost the ability to do what it is you want to do. When I think of that, I think of really that while there may be ways that we can manage it as healthcare workers, really it's not within our power to eradicate it.
Exactly.
And physicians and physicians in training, I think are made to feel as if they have more power over their level of burnout than they really do. So that being said, I think, burnout can lead to a lot of, mental and physical distress that could, that then sort of sits outside of the definition of burnout. Things like substance abuse, depression, anxiety disorders, suicidality. You know, I want to make it, really abundantly clear that those don't sit under the umbrella of burnout. They are a direct result in some
Right.
cases of chronic workplace stress. And there are studies, I mean, you can find just about any study linking burnout to any type of bad outcome that you can imagine.
Hmm.
So, I've mentioned some that are really individually like depression and anxiety and suicidality, but there are also a considerable number of studies that link burnout in medical professionals, specifically physicians, to things like worse quality of care. Physicians who are burned out are more likely to report having made serious medical errors. It's linked to decreased patient satisfaction, decreased clinical productivity, lapses in professional behavior, decreases in empathy. And then students who are burned out, and again, linked to the structure and organization of medical school, they're more likely to also have lapses in their professional behavior. There's studies that shows that students who are burned out are more likely to cheat, for example, on exams. And because of that, that group of consequences, it certainly impacts patient care. But when we think about how it impacts the entire system, the other thing we have to think about is turnover. So physicians who are burned out are more likely to leave medicine early, retire early, change jobs. And so I saw an estimation that burnout costs the medical or the healthcare system almost $5 billion a year
Wow.
because of, increased turnover and physicians reducing their work hours because, they really need the time to recover.
Yeah. And I like one of the things that you said there too, in that I feel, especially, in the last 10, 15 years, especially since I've been in medicine, you see this shift, at least in theory, that physicians have control over this, and that, we have the keys to the car, to the vehicle, essentially, of driving burnout or not. And so, there are some methods that have been introduced, their wellness, retreats and things like that to kind of identify it. But I think that it's a gift and a curse in some respects, right? Because at the same time, a lot of things that burn physicians out, and I can speak for some of our partners, and I feel like every medical professional, especially any of us that have practiced through the pandemic, have felt it at one point or the other. You can see things that are occurring in the healthcare system that are causing burnout, right? So like if you don't have access to, the medications that you need, if you don't have access to even the rooms, the physical space to see your patients, you feel as though you're not providing the adequate care to your patients that you could otherwise do if those things were remedied, right? And to a certain extent, a lot of those things are outside of, the control of the physicians, in the moment, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of it has to do with, things, at a legislative level, things at a, insurance level, at a private equity level. All those things are playing a role in it. But I appreciate that you brought that up, because this is something that a lot of, amongst us professionally, we all talk about, and identifying it is a key point. But there are other things that are going into it that may not be within the purview of us controlling as physicians, but it is good to know and good to see those signs in yourself.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think, the problem that I see that's happened, and I absolutely appreciate that healthcare systems, hospitals, medical institutions are trying to take some responsibility for the well-being of their employees, of their staff. But the bottom line is they were not designed, they were not set up to take care of us in that way, right? So like wellness retreats or mindfulness modules, meditation, yoga, all those things that, sort of are creeping into our hospitals and our clinics. That's just not what that's not what they're good at.
Right,
But
right,
what they could be good at is everything else that you just mentioned, right? They could be good at really, and they should be, at looking at the underlying drivers of burnout specifically, meaning the occupational hazards that we encounter every day, the fact that our administrative burden is, so high, the fact that, as you point out, there's a tremendous amount of moral distress that we encounter because our values and how we want to take care of patients don't seem to be lining up with the resources that were provided in our clinical workspaces. And, from that standpoint, that, that there's not a one size fits all in that. And in my section, so in our section of emergency medicine, what makes me well from an occupational standpoint is not what makes my colleagues in anesthesia well. And,
Exactly.
I learned that when I was the professional health committee chair at Children's for several years. And one of the things that I embarked on when I started was to talk to every single section in the Department of Pediatrics and then all the pediatric divisions of our colleagues on the adult side. And, something like, for example, Epic, most sections I spoke with had a lot of problems with Epic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Its usability, the amount of time that they spent at home charting on patients. But then you go and you talk to anesthesia and they were like, this is the best thing that we've ever had.
Great.
This
Yeah,
makes
best
my
build
life
ever.
1,000 times easier, right? Because it was designed really well for them. And
Yeah.
so, if hospitals are going to set aside resources and time to make changes, structural changes that would impact burnout, not only do they have to recognize that that's their lane, they also have to understand that it's local. And that it's hard to put all of that on a chief wellness officer, right? Who's
Right.
responsible for the entire healthcare system. That responsibility really should be diffused throughout the organization. And those people at the local level should be empowered to make the changes that they need to make in order to change the working environments of their people.
Yeah. Yeah. And for some of our younger listeners, we have a lot of medical students that listen to the program as well, people who are pursuing careers in medicine, et cetera. What are some of the signs? You talked a little bit about it, but just I feel that identifying it in the beginning and identifying those signs in yourself are things that could be very helpful in terms of, remedying your situation, either it be, as you said before, a career change or learning how to, improve those measures within your own discipline. What are some of the signs and symptoms of burnout that you normally will teach people?
Sure. So, it's interesting because I talk less and less about burnout with my students and more about it with physicians. But because it looks so different in medical school than it does in the clinical space. But for medical students, there's the three main components of burnout. The first is emotional exhaustion. And that is really, I talk about that in terms of when you are presented with a problem, maybe you go and you're talking with a standardized patient and you can't muster the sort of the interest or the compassion or the empathy for the person sitting across from you because it's just the well is dry. You just can't pull it from someone. You're sort of going through the motions. It's almost mechanical. That's one of those sort of telltale signs of emotional exhaustion that I advise students to pay attention to. And whether the underlying reason for that is burnout or something else, it's good to recognize when that's happening. The second component is cynicism, which, I think emergency medicine physicians sort of rely on cynicism.
I was going to say, and that's another very specialty specific thing too, but go ahead.
I happen to really thrive with sarcasm and a little bit of cynicism because I think, when we're not using it as a defense mechanism, humor can really sort of boost all of our moods. But that being said, if you really feel like it's not worth it, that no matter what you do, nothing's going to change, And in students, that can feel like it doesn't matter how hard I study. It doesn't matter how many hours I spend, studying for step one or for this exam. Like it won't matter in the end. I'm not going to do as well as I want to. And then the last is really sort of a loss of personal efficacy. And what's interesting to me is that both in medical students and in physicians, this is really the last sign of burnout. It's almost like you not as many people reach that point. And I think it's because we are sort of a group of people who really have at least to convince ourselves that what we're doing, like that we can do it, that we have that if we really just put in enough time, it will be fine. But when that gets lost, when you feel as if that you are not going to be able to help someone in front of you, that you are not going to be able to really be the kind of physician that you want to be, that's sort of the final nail in the coffin, as they say. It tends to happen in that order. And emotional exhaustion tends to be the most commonly seen symptom in both medical students and physicians.
Yeah. And like you said, I think a lot of it too is based in our culture, right? And so, especially in medicine, we have this delayed gratification. A lot of us who have been working at this for years, it starts in undergrad. For some people, it starts before that. It starts in high school. You're on this pathway of achieving this goal of being a physician or being a PA or being whatever healthcare professional, and it'll be better when. Right. So everything is bad now, but it'll be better when I get to residency. Everything is bad in residency. It'll be better when I become, a fellow, et cetera, et cetera. It goes into your career. And on the whole, if you're starting to feel those stages, and like Cassie said, if you get to that tertiary stage there, then you're at that position where no matter what, no, your outlook on things are remaining the same. And so I think it's really important and very prudent, especially as a group of individuals who are caring for other people who are depending on our empathy, who are depending on us bringing the best part of us, or the best version of us to work in order to care for them. It's very important to care for yourself in those situations first, before it spins out of the control.
hmm hmm Yeah, I think that it's a hard thing to talk about with students and physicians too, because, the response is, and this makes sense, is like, well, what control do I have over these conditions, right?
Hmm.
And students in particular, I think, just feeling at the mercy of the structure of medical education, the amount of work, the amount of studying that's required to get through medical school, it doesn't feel like you have any say over that whatsoever. And, in large part, you don't.
It is what
And
it is.
right. And
Yeah.
even recognizing that and saying,
Hmm.
okay, yeah, what do I have control over, and what is outside of my control, so I can let go of that and really focus on the things that land in under my control, and focusing on those. And, one of those things that I talk about frequently is just pausing. It's,
Mm.
one of the most powerful tools we have is rest and recovery, and that idea of pausing. And this is something that carries over into the clinical space as well. We are always going, going, going,
Hmm.
and we rarely give ourselves permission to stop and to just kind of take inventory of what's going on emotionally for us, and naming those emotions, and and then choosing our behavior based on what we're feeling. And I think that when we get deep into burnout, we neglect to pause, and our emotions drive our behavior because we're not recognizing them. We're not realizing that we're angry, for example. We're not realizing that we're in grief. And
Mm.
and so they just drive how we act in the world. And that doesn't end well
Yeah.
for students or physicians.
Yeah. Well, Cassie, I'll tell you, you are one of my heroes, and have been for quite some time. I remember I rotated through the peds ER back when I was a medical student, and I believe that's right when you first started. And so, I have always, been in awe of how you manage some of these things, And in addition, how you teach and are able to carry that message through to, your colleagues as well as some students coming up. But could you share with us how you personally manage stress and maintain, your well-being throughout your career?
Hmm. Yeah. So I think I had a turning point, as many of us did in 2020 in the pandemic. And, I've had the opportunity to sort of look back and reflect on what that period of time looked like and meant for me. And I think that was, as much as I had really been talking about and teaching about well-being, I don't know that I truly understood exactly what I was talking about until I had the opportunity to go through the pandemic with the rest of the world. And
Mm.
I remember sitting in my living room. We were actually listening to the school board discussion and listening to them talk about how, well, the kids were going to be out of school for 2 weeks. And I was like, that's unimaginable. What am I going to do with my kids for
Hmm.
2 whole weeks? Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
And then as the reality kind of set in, not only was I, trying to figure out how I was going to, I had, I have 3 kids, and the youngest of whom was in the first grade at the time, like how I was going to manage school at home. And then was going, thinking about, well, I'm also going into the emergency department where we were facing things like we didn't have N95s, we didn't have gowns, we didn't have, well, we didn't really have anything, but we didn't have
Yeah.
any idea what it was to take care of a patient with COVID, what that meant as far as our risk, what it meant to the risk that I was bringing home to my family. But my initial instincts and what kicked in was like, okay, well, my kids they're going to get online and they're going to learn how to write from like the New York Times, and
Hmm.
we're going to do yoga together at lunchtime, and we're going to take nature walks. And, I was going to learn to make sourdough bread, all the things that I was like, okay, well, if I don't have control over this, then I'm going to take control over everything else in my life. And I, because my natural way of dealing with things, and I think a lot of ours who are in the medical profession, is to overfunction. That is our
Hmm.
response. When we are presented with a challenge, how do I do not only what's necessary, but like 10 times that? And that's what I've learned is is a way, it's as a result of being perfectionists. It's also sort of helps us armor up against feeling vulnerable, right?
Right.
So if we're just working, we can't ever stop and understand how vulnerable we feel. Um,
Hmm.
and so I kept that up for about 2 months. And then I suddenly, well, not suddenly, but I started waking up at like 3 in the morning. And every day it would be three. I would roll over and look at my clock. It was 3 a.m. and I couldn't fall back asleep. So I would get up and I would start, doing something, working, doing something related to the kids' school. And this went on for a couple months,
Mm.
every single morning. I started having like feeling my heart race, like where to the
Hmm.
point where I couldn't catch my breath. I would cry on my way to work. I would cry on my way home from work. I would get really upset when, like, if my husband would make very sensible suggestions, like, you don't need to sleep at the hospital, like, just come
Mm.
home, change your scrubs,
Yep.
like, you can stay here. I would get just incensed, like he didn't understand what I was
Hmm.
having to deal with. And I did all of that. And this was what I think was the biggest takeaway, is I was experiencing all of that alone.
Mm.
I didn't tell anybody else. I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell, my sister, who's a confidant of mine. I didn't tell my best friends. And it wasn't until I broke down in front of one of my friends, who luckily also happens to be a psychiatrist. And she said,
Mm.
okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to call
Yeah.
your primary care doctor. You're going to get on a Zoom visit with her, and you're going to tell her that you would like some Lexapro. And that's what I did. and I started Lexapro in May of that year. And it didn't it didn't take away it didn't wipe everything away, but it meant that I slept. It meant that I stopped having headaches. It meant that I stopped, having heart palpitations. And it at least gave me sort of that pause, right? That the ability to rest and recover when I needed to. And it, I think the biggest shift that happened was that I now reach out when I'm hurting. Like, even if it's just to like text a friend and just be like, hey, this horrible thing happened at the hospital. I don't really know what to do next. Or to say, hey, can we go get a cup of coffee? And so I have this very specific way, like when I notice I'm not doing well, I try and name the feeling. Like, is it exhaustion? Is it
Mm.
grief? Is it anger? I sort of, this is going to sound crazy, but I welcome those emotions into the fold. Sometimes I name
Yeah.
them. So, like, I have this particular voice in my head that's very critical, that sort of,
Hmm.
is like, oh, you're not doing as well as you should. You should be doing these 20 other things. And I named that voice Reese Witherspoon for a
There you
variety
go.
of reasons. So I'll say, like, okay, there's Reese Witherspoon. I'll give myself some compassion for those feelings. And then I'll just try and check off the easy things, right? Am I thirsty? Sometimes I just need a glass of water. Am I
Hmm. Hmm.
hungry? Do I need to get outside? And if it's more than that, if it's truly overwhelmed, then I will stop. And as I said, I will reach out to people. And I think that has been a game changer. And it's that sense of interdependence and interconnectedness, and that real feeling that we are all sort of entangled with one another, and that makes us so much stronger. That has been key to my, staying well, or at least recognizing when I'm not well and being able to recover.
Yeah. And, thank you for sharing that because I feel like a lot of us, especially in medicine, but, just in modern society, we try to push off those feelings, right? Especially, in the medical field, we're told to just continue to push and take care of your patients and move the meat in emergency medicine, right? That's the adage, to just kind of get patients to their disposition. But to take that time to, first off, like you said, identify the feeling, and then secondly, name the feeling, and then try to figure out a way, how you're going to not only accept that but also move forward. Those are things that we typically don't do, especially if you have any other strains, both personally in your family, financially for a lot of folks too. And I feel like the one of the silver linings out of the pandemic was to provide that silence for a minute, right? Like, we had so much that we were dealing with in the moment, and a lot of that was unknown as well. We didn't know what we were up against, and we didn't know sort of the social strains and the economic strains that it would have. But it provided that time for us to look further into that, right? To build our emotional IQ to say, this is something that I'm feeling, and that's okay. Right. It's okay to seek that treatment. It's okay to take a step back and not care for everyone, but care for yourself as well. And without doing that, these symptoms manifest and it can turn dangerous, especially in the medical field, as we've seen in the most recent years. We've seen a number of folks who unfortunately have been at their time of crisis that, have committed suicide or, have turned to substance abuse, et cetera, et cetera. And so, naming that goes a long way in preventing those outcomes. And it's prudent for us to do so as the stakes are very high, and you need to know that about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that we don't teach medical students, I don't think that anyone really learns this, honestly, and no matter what profession or career or job they have, we in medicine, we're witness to suffering. Like, it's really sort of the central part of our job, and perhaps more in emergency medicine than other fields, but it doesn't matter. We're witness to all sorts of pain and
Hmm.
suffering, and whether it's our own or our patients or friends or colleagues or whoever, we're not really taught the impact that that can have, short and long term, and we're certainly not taught what to do with it. And one of the things that has stuck with me, there's a meditation teacher named Ram Dass. He died a couple years ago, but he has this he says this a lot, and basically he said that we have, as a species, as human beings, we have a natural aversion to suffering, right?
Mm.
And that our tendency is to try and distance ourselves from it. And in many ways, the pandemic made it impossible to do that. Suffering
Mm-hmm.
was, we were steeped in it. And I think it sort of showed where the cracks were in
Mm-hmm.
our profession in particular around well-being. Because, even in a perfect system, even if our healthcare system decided tomorrow that they were going to implement every structural and organizational change that we needed in order to, support healthcare professionals. The fact of
Mm-hmm.
the matter is you and I would still show up tomorrow and we would still be witness to, you know, to telling somebody that they have leukemia, to
Mm-hmm.
seeing a child try and die by suicide, to seeing kids drown, right? So we see just enormous pain in our job. And that's not going to go away, even
Mm-mm.
if our hospital changes all of its policies to support our well being. And if we don't develop the skills to sit with that suffering and really metabolize it, as opposed to like use all of our skills to push it away and to maintain our distance from it, we're going to be, we really are going to be consumed by it. And that's like when we choose, when instead of sitting with it, we do things like try and numb ourselves, right? So that's why we have substance abuse issues. We try and compartmentalize it away. And those types of responses are what got me to where I got in 2020.
Right.
I literally was sort of consumed by it because I wasn't responding to it and not able to sort of see it for what it was. And those are really the skills that I think that I feel a responsibility to teach to students and to physicians who never learned them as students. And that's where I feel like I can make a difference, right? I mean, that's where I feel like we have a locus of control there. We have leverage there. Again, we may not be able to force the hospital to make changes, but we can really work on how we sit with suffering.
Yeah. And I wholeheartedly agree with you on that. And just to get back to some of the other things that you're doing too, you recently wrote a manuscript on, outlining some of the principles of medical student well-being. But as we discussed before this too, I feel like this message should be brought out to everyone. I feel like this could have applicability for everyone in every walk of life. And you're currently working on that manuscript as well to encapsulate everyone else too. Can you give us an overview of some of the key themes and some of the key messages in your book and that message that you're giving out?
Yeah. Well, and it really starts with that. The central premise is that all of us, like all human beings, are witness to suffering, and that we don't really deal with the fallout of what all that witnessing does to us as well as we could. Mostly because, as I said, we tend to find suffering aversive. You know, a recent story came to mind when I was thinking about what this means or what this actually looks like in the practice of medicine. And, I took care of a little boy who had gone to a friend's pool party. And by the time other parents had noticed that he was gone, he had been at the bottom of the pool for several minutes. And,
Gotcha.
and EMS was able to get a pulse back before they brought him to our trauma bay. But he was really sick. And I was the one who was responsible for telling his father, his dad, who had just dropped him off at this party hours before, perfectly happy, perfectly healthy. And I was responsible for sort of deciding how much truth was merciful, right? Like
Hmm.
this idea that, I didn't think that his son would ever leave the hospital. And I had to tell him something along those lines. And so all of us are constantly reminded of how fragile life is. I mean, I had a son. I have a son who's the same age as his son.
Hmm.
And it seemed natural to want to turn away from that pain, to completely avoid it, completely avoid talking about it. And so that the tendency, or really sitting with it, it feels so counterintuitive, because we think that we're going to be swallowed up by it. And what Ram Dass said was that when we do that, then we're really at the mercy of suffering. So the book is really about how we keep our hearts open amidst suffering, or how we bear the unbearable. And I tell it obviously through my lens as a physician, but also as, a daughter and a mother and a wife and a friend. And I really talk about the skills that we need in order to be present with suffering through stories. So certainly my own stories that I have from medical training and medical practice, and then my colleagues. I interviewed many medical students for the book who told me their stories, and really sort of use that framework to talk about and introduce very specific strategies and skills that we can kind of operationalize what it means to sit with suffering, right? That sounds really great.
Hmm.
Sounds very poetic, but what does that actually look like in everyday practice? Like, what does that look like in all of our lives, and how do we actually make that happen? And so that's really what the book is focused on.
Awesome. So where can our listeners, I know that you're currently in the process of working on it, but where will they eventually be able to find your book, and how can they learn more about your work?
Sure. So right now I'm in the process of editing, so it could be this is the first time I've written a book, so I am not sure when the time will come. My hope is, sometime late next year, but it will be widely available, is my hope. Right now, I do write on Substack. So I have a Substack account, which I'm happy to share with
Yeah.
you. It's under Cassie Ferguson. And that I really use that as sort of just a holding space for stories that are in my head that I want to get out on paper, some of
Hmm.
which will, appear in various forms in the book itself, and some of which are just sort of musings that I, just want to get on paper. But that's probably the best way. And then, certainly as far as, other things that I do at MCW, as you mentioned, the thing that I'm most involved with and is closest to my heart are the Health Equity Scholars and the Health Equity Scholars program. And that program can be, information about that program can be found on MCW's website.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely link all that to. I know the Health Equity Scholars program is already linked to the website, but we'll definitely link your Substack and some of the articles that you've done in the past and some of the amazing work that you've done. And I want to thank you so much for coming out and sharing your thoughts. This is very valuable for not only our medical students, but for all of our listeners. I feel like wellness and especially, building up our emotional intelligence, talking to ourselves through some of the issues that we're going to, and actually allowing ourselves to feel those feelings will go a long way in terms of healing us as a whole person and then going forward. But with that being said, do you have any final thoughts or any final messages that you would like to share with our audience?
No, I think, I want to say thank you to you too. I feel like so often physicians' stories aren't told, and that the more that we can make the lay public, aware of what it is, we do every day, and the
Hmm.
kinds of situations we find ourselves in. I think one of the things that's been hardest, and I think has really been difficult for physicians and medical students' well-being recently and post-pandemic, is sort of this, you know, the politicalization of, and I said that word wrong, but
I'm with you.
making
Yeah.
thank you. Making
Yeah.
vaccines, for example, making science political. And that I think has been really hard for those of us who are doing this every day to withstand and to feel as if, we are really seen for what it is we're trying to do, which is to compassionately care for other people and everybody, And so I think, you putting yourself out there on this podcast and pulling in voices of physicians and people who are really connected with the healthcare system is a powerful part of changing that narrative and really making it clear that, that we are all interconnected and we all rely on one another so intimately that to sort of to view healthcare through that lens will be it hurts. It hurts
Hmm.
us.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I appreciate you doing what you're doing and thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Cassie. I appreciate it. And best of luck with everything you do. And I'm sure I'll be in touch with you. Hope to help out in any way that I can with the college program as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Very special thanks to Dr. Ferguson for coming out and speaking with us. We're very much looking forward to seeing all the things that she's going to continue to do with the Health Equity Scholars Program, as well as all the things that she's going to do with healthcare provider wellness. I want to thank you all for coming out and listening again. As always, we're very much looking forward to the new year. We're going to have some great episodes on the horizon. We're going to have some things that we're going to be doing with the show as well. So looking forward to unveiling that and to have you all involved as you always have been since the beginning of the show. So feel free to continue to reach out, continue to ask questions, and to provide your insights so we can tailor this to how you all want. This is a community show. We're looking forward to using this show as we have been in the past to help improve the issues as we see it in our communities, as well as to help create a grounds for discussion of these topics. Tune in the upcoming weeks. We got another great episode on the horizon. And with that being said, as always, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. And if you need me, come and see me.